I will now welcome the third speaker to this afternoon session, Dr. Alexander Budzier. Works at the University of Oxford Said Business School. Prior to join Oxford, he worked at T-Mobile International in London, and most recently as a consultant with McKinsey Business Technology Office in Düsseldorf and Chicago. He knows a lot of things, one or two, about IT projects that run over time and over budget. Rings a bell as well for us in the Commission. And his job is to look at the impact of rare events, the famous 9/11 events, Black Swan events, that make your plans getting lost very fast. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Exactly, and I think where our presentations connect the best is actually looking at the leadership challenge that is comprised by these particular risks, even though a lot of these come actually from inside your organization rather than the outside. And I just started a little bit of digging, and mostly with Wikipedia and just some newspapers. And it's an interesting challenge, and it does cost people their jobs. So if you remember back to earlier or summer last year, there was a whole discussion around the healthcare.gov platform in the US. So the federal system for all the states that didn't implement a healthcare exchange on the local level. And with the overburdening complexity, this whole thing first was costed to be around 350 million and quickly spiraled to 500 million in project cost, which is not very unheard of in the public sector. But interestingly enough, so on the one hand, it has direct implication to the citizens then, because still at this very moment, about 1 in 10 of the enrollments that are made through the platform have so many errors that they need manual work at the end of this process. So it's also very costly, and it creates a lot of problems, including medical bankruptcies. But it's even more important because had the midterm elections fallen onto that, or had the presidential election fallen into that time frame, most pundits agree that it would have cost the US president his job. And here's another example, also a digitization project, this time from the BBC, which tried to digitize all its workflows, from the archive through production planning to having it online, having it on air, and then going back into the archives. This whole thing took about 5 years, and it had a cost overrun, as many projects do, and the BBC had to take 100 million write-down. So they use about 2/3 of the functionality in very different aspects of the organizations. But over those 100 million write-downs, the chief information officer was basically retired, and at the moment he is in court to countersue against unlawful dismissal. So there will be a whole other saga coming up onto this. And here's another example from the private sector. These things don't only happen in the public sector. It's the A380. I don't know if you remember that. It's a little further, it's a little while back. And the designs for the planes were finished in 2001. The planes successfully made its maiden flight. And when it started to be rolled out into production, one of the very first customers, Emirates Airlines, said, well, we're going to pay 250 to 300 million per plane for this. We would like to make some customizations. And so Airbus asked them, what do you want? And they says, well, we would like to have a spiral staircase connecting the lower floor with the upper deck. And we would have a nice little first-class bar up there. So they got out the saw and made a 2-meter hole in the floor in between the decks and discovered there's lots of cables there. So now, in all European projects, the problem was that parts of the cables were managed in Germany, namely the ones with the flight systems, and the other parts of the cables that had to do with water and entertainment were managed in Spain, with a little unfortunate circumstance that the CAD software that they used was the same CAD software, but on different versions, which meant that there was no configuration management possible between the planes, and so for all customization requests, planes had to design from scratch, which ultimately led to a 12-month delay to market. So once they finally got back into batch processing these things, and the share price of Airbus dropped 26%. So a lot of people lost a lot of money. and the CIO, CEO, Noel Forgeard, and most of his senior team lost their jobs too. And probably the most spectacular thing, digging into what IT projects can actually do, is the sad case of Kmart, who isn't around anymore because they tried to do an IT project. So they were the US's third largest retailer, market cap of $6 billion US, so a massive company. And they didn't really invest in IT because they thought that internet thing and IT, it's not really going to happen. And at the same time, Walmart, the biggest competitor, Target is number 2, Walmart was shooting satellites into space as a private company just to enable communication between their shops and the central data center. And so Kmart ran into lots of issues, and they finally started to get on track and started a project to rectify this. Being an organization that was still run by mainframes and had a mainframe IT shop, of course their solution was to build a big monolithical IT system that did cost $1.5 billion at the end. So they finished the project. That was a success. However, they ended up with operations costs of about 200 to 300 million a month. For this project, just to operate and maintain it, which is quite a lot for an industry where you have about 5% margin. So they started to do a second project to start cleaning this up, and this time they modularized the IT architecture, and they decided not to start with inventory or finance, but with supply chain management. Another 500 million, and that project ran into troubles, which, together with some accounting irregularities, forced Kmart into bankruptcy. And it was so bad that actually the bankruptcy judge, so this is the US, Chapter 11 protection, the first ruling of the bankruptcy judge was that the IT department is not fit for purpose and that they can't make any further IT acquisitions. Sad story, at the end of this, they sold off all foreign subsidies. So if you go to Australia, they're still there because an Australian chain bought them. So the brand is still there. In the US, so overall, they closed about 800 shops, laid off 6,000 people. And at the end of it, they were bought by Sears. And the moment they came out of bankruptcy, Sears was, they were switched over to Sears system to regain some capabilities. So from a research perspective, these sound quite big because they either end people's career, not only the CIOs, but the CEOs, politicians, very senior figures, and they can even wipe off whole companies off the face of the earth. So our question for our research was actually, oops, what did I do now? Whether this kind of incidents, whether this kind of troubles are just anecdotal evidence, or if that's actually something that we should be really aware of in IT. So we started to do a large research project. It took us about 5 years, and we built a database of 4,307 projects where we traced their behavior and their characteristics over time. And this is just showing you some of the detailed information. I won't go deeper into this. But so on average, just to give you a flavor, these projects take about 3 years. So the average value of the project, it varies widely because we also look at South-to-South trade. So for instance, what is an Indian outsourcer being able to do in South Africa is a very different price point from what you get when you ask the same company to deliver a service here. And we also see that when we talk about IT projects, 90% of those are software-led. And we come, only very few are actually infrastructure-led in this space. Our biggest first research hypothesis, and that was actually how I started this project, was to think about, so before I joined Oxford, I was working on a lot of large IT projects, and mostly when they actually ran into these kind of troubles. And I joined a research group at Oxford who looked mostly at engineering projects in the transport infrastructure space. And this was my research hypothesis, namely that we could actually learn something from engineering. If IT could just be a bit more like engineering, the world would be so much better, and we would have so much less to worry about. And who would agree with that? Can I have a quick show of hands that projects in engineering are much better, or actually better, and let's pick out one performance I mentioned, which is cost overruns, much better at delivering to budgets than we are in IT? Okay, no, not really. Actually, they are. Oh, they're not. And so here you see the cost distribution, cost overrun. On the x-axis of this chart is the cost overruns, and on the y-axis is the frequency with which they happened in these 4,300 projects. And the orange line, or the brownish line on these projectors, is the IT projects, and the blue one is a sample of transport infrastructure projects. And you can see that the bump of it, the bump of these two distributions is actually around 0. So 50% of the projects finish on budget, to budget. So that's a pretty healthy message. So most projects actually do what they're supposed to be doing or delivering against the budget constraints has been set. However, there is a key difference in this chart, and that's the length of the tail. And so what we actually see here, that about 233% was the largest infrastructure overrun we had in this data set. And IT goes on and on and on. It's almost infinite. Actually, the worst one is about 33,000% cost overrun, which is the Canadian Firearms Registry, which is also a very sad project. And that is indeed the real risk when we talk about IT. It's the length of these tails. And we see that in IT, projects are 100 times more likely to fall outside in these long tails than they are in engineering. And the interesting bit, which is sort of this other gray bell-shaped curve behind this, is that we see when organizations do, or most organizations do, their risk assessment and assumption-based, and you feed it in Primavera and you do all the Monte Carlo simulation, all these cool snazzy little things, you end up with something that looks like that. Looks like a bell-shaped curve. And looks like there will be overruns, there will be underruns. If it's true that 50% of the projects come on budget, it will kind of equalize each other out. However, there is a massive difference in terms of that really is underestimating the tail and the amount of deviance and variations in the sample. All right, let me go a little further into this. Oops, I'm still not good at this clicker. And it actually shows that the risks are quite high. If an event or if a project ends up in the tail of this kind of distribution, we're talking about 615% cost overrun as the expected value, with about 40% schedule overrun at the same time. And interesting enough, you also see here the benefit shortfall, that if a project really explodes, there's often the pressure to realize a bit more benefits, so that they actually do about 10% more benefits, or realize 10% more of the benefits than initially planned at the end. And it happens in 18% of the cases. So 18% of the observation in our sample actually in the tails. That's a risk of almost 1 in 5 projects, where these massive disruptions going to happen to your portfolio. So, and this is the cross-comparison against the other industries. So this is sorted by cost overruns, and this is road projects, which have the lowest cost overrun on averages, and then it's links, which is fixed links, it's bridges and tunnels. There's energy projects, rail, and large dams, and IT is the second highest. And then there's the Olympics, which is the worst cost overrun ever. And I highlighted here one figure, which is the rate of these outliers, which is 18% in IT, and is the highest across all engineering disciplines that we looked at. If you, just for fun, if you look at the other things in the Olympics, the interesting bit about that is that none of the Olympics is ever delivered late. So 10 out of 10 on time, well done. But you get 219% cost overrun. So that's sort of the figure you have to budget for if you want to be on time. Here's another of our research hypotheses. The public sector is so much worse at this than the private sector. True? Who would agree with that the public sector is worse? So a little more show of hands, thank you. Actually, this is the data, teasing it out. There is no statistically significant difference between the risks, between how often outliers occur and the size of the outliers between the public and the private sector. So all of them face the same issues. It's my kind of, I think it's more to do that the private sector is much better at hiding these things and there's less transparency around this. But there is one difference, which is the technology-led change in government. And you see here it is split up between pure technology projects, so hardcore infrastructure projects, and if the project has a change component, a business change component to this. And we actually see here there is a significant increase in the cost overruns from 5% on average in technology projects to about 20% if there is a change component to the project itself. Schedule risks go down slightly from 54 to 41, although that's not significant. For the technology projects, we didn't have good enough benefits data, so I can't say what that is, but technology-led change projects have on average a benefit shortfall of 24%, and the risk of an outlier is similar between 12 and 15% for both of these cases. So this is public sector data. This is an interesting challenge actually where we see one difference between the public and the private sector that isn't there in the private sector. Here's another interesting question that we had. Are bigger projects riskier? Meaning bigger money? Yeah, some hands. Which is interesting. Only a few of you would agree with that, but most governance structures, most organizations tend to be cut by what's the budget size. If you're a bigger project, you report into this board. If you're a very big project, you actually get top management attention. However, we see that doesn't really show on the risk. So there's zero correlation between the actual project budget, or the planned project budget in this case, and the cost overrun of the project. And it is even a bit more pronounced if you just look at the rate of the outliers, and those go down. The larger the project, the fewer these outliers happen. So that risk is actually decreasing with the budget size. So big projects, just in terms of money, are actually not something to fear. So let me rephrase that question a little. Longer projects are riskier than shorter projects. Yeah, who believes that? Oh yeah, great. I think your intuition serves you right. On average, we don't really see that much. There's also a lot of noise in the data. So on average, 1 year, 12 months of project duration at only 1 percentage point of cost risk. That's almost negligible. However, if you look at the rate of the outliers, that really goes up. And above 3 years or 3 years out, we see it's more than 1 in 5 projects that really explode. So the longer the project, that's actually a real risk factor for the project being very destabilized, not the bigger. So if you have the trade-off to make between budget size and length of the project, it's always best to compress the project as much as possible. Here's another interesting observation that we made around benefits management. So this was our research hypothesis that the lack of benefits management is one of the key things to actually also get cost and schedule under control. Yeah, would you agree with that? That focusing on outcomes? Not so much. Let's look at the data. And here you actually see this is a subset of the samples where the organizations, public and private sector, require that the full quantified benefits case, so a full cost benefit analysis is done for every IT project. And we see that even in these organizations, only 44% of the projects have a benefits case attached, even though it's company policy or organizational policy. But if they do, within these organizations, so if they actually track a number, the cost risks go down by factor 6, the schedule risks go down by factor 2, benefits risk, of course, we can't really compare, and the risk of these outliers go down by factor 3. So there is an interesting observation here that we see once there is a number attached, even though if it's a spurious number or difficult to manage and never changes, but even if there is just a number attached to that, projects make very different trade-off decisions that lead to very different outcomes, which drives very different organizational dynamics. Here's another one, which is an interesting hypothesis because we talked about transparency all day. So knowing your project performance and making that transparent, does that improve project performance? Yeah, I see some hands, some believers in open data. Actually, it does. So this is data from organizations where we went back to the very earliest recording of the performance of the projects. And you see basically where these lines start. These organizations, so the left 3 ones are private sector cases, the green one is a public sector case. All these organizations started to record the performance of their projects and share that amongst their project managers. And we see that actually the average cost overrun, and the same is true for schedule and benefits, goes down, but it takes a while. So for these effects to be visible, it takes about 18 to 24 months, according to these observations that we made here. Here's another interesting hypothesis that we had. Does Agile help? Yes? No? Who believes in Agile? Okay. So again, here's the split of the data for the projects where we knew the delivery methodology. About a third of the projects that we observe from these 4,307 delivered as a big bang. That is quite still a sizable approach, and often is driven by having very complicated legacy architectures. Then there's the projects that do few big releases, so basically projects that break down in 2 or 3 releases during the course of the project. And then it goes into the multiple releases a year logic, where you have 3 or 4 releases of functionality here. And then at the very end of the spectrum, there's the fully agile Scrum type of projects, which are in the minority, actually. And we see when we look at the cost schedule overruns, the benefits, and again, these outlier projects, that the only statistical significant difference is the schedule performance. So from what we see in the data here is that with Agile project, because they're very good at time boxing, the schedule risk goes down by factor 2. All the other dimensions are not automatically captured. So in that sense, Agile isn't actually really a silver bullet. And here's one thing which is not statistically significant but quite a strong trend, is the average benefit shortfall between the old-style Big Bang projects and the more agile projects is quite significant, or is quite large. So 15% benefit shortfall on average for the ones that go with 1 release or 2 or 3 releases during the course of the project, to if there is more of a release logic behind the project, the average benefit shortfall was 46%. So few of the intended benefits get realized. However, there's a lot of noise in the data, so it doesn't really register as being statistically significant. All right. I have a final question, which is getting into more of the cures, although we touched on some of those, as in long projects are bad, big projects are not necessarily bad, so they actually give a lot of room to maneuver. Agile is good at time boxing, benefits management really makes count. Having projects transparent internal and project performance internal and transparent organization helps as well. So the last question I have is then, can we actually spot those things early? Can we be predictive about them? And there's a bit coming down to this. Can you spot which of these signets is going to be a black swan? There is one thing about this, and there's a little connection. Oh, I'll do the reveal of the quiz. It's the left one here. And you see that the telltale sign is just that little band between the beak and the nose. So that's the only thing that actually distinguishes these 2 little birds from each other, and one turns out black, the other turns out white. That's something I learned off Wikipedia. And if we mine the data for it, we actually see, I won't go through these in details what all these things are, but one of the biggest risk factors or biggest risk indicators are 2 things. And one is that the baseline wobbles early. So with early black swans, where already during contract negotiation, the cost baselines and the schedule baselines need to be rethought and increased. That's a red flag. And then combined with that, if project managers and implementers say that this project is unique, it's a clear sign that this project is in for trouble. So the next time somebody is coming to you and saying his project is unique, you need to fire that person immediately, because it might be your job that is on the line at the end. And so with that, I wanted to close, and just a quick outlook on sort of what we see actually, what different organizations out there in this field are doing. So the first one has to do really 5 steps that we see in the industry, public and private sector, being taken. The one is really transparency around project performances. So the benchmarking, the knowing, the sharing of the information internally. And then as a second step, that we see first efforts at doing project assurance and independent project estimates, and more organization being done to actually verify that baselines are reasonable, to actually see whether system integrators are lowballing their bids just to get your job, and then they will just make the money back later. And we see that being done in some organizations for flagship projects that are particularly large or varying. And then sort of as a third step, we see that being folded into the stage gate processes. Nearly every organization has some sort of stage gate logic or decision gate logic to advance their project from ideation to actually going into operation. And if something like an independent quality assurance and review is done for these projects, problems can be spotted earlier from an institutional level. The fourth thing, which I touched upon a little here, and again, I put a lot of articles on here if you want to read any further, and I'm happy to share those afterwards, is about these black swans. And I only touched on a few of the highlights here, but it's really about identifying organizational behaviors that increase the fragility of projects and increase the social and technical complexities, and identifying which levers are there and which early warning indicators are there to actually reduce the social and technical complexity to get rid of these outlier projects that can cost you your job and your boss your job. And then the fifth one is the interesting one, which we're doing a bit of research at the moment on, is really what's the leadership angle of this. So if you survived in this industry for 40 years, and you've delivered projects on budget and on time, you probably have done something right. And we've started to begin to identify in a very systematic fashion what kind of these heuristics, what these leadership lessons are that you acquire 40 years in the industry. And if you can just share those and shave off maybe 5 years of everybody's learning experience, it would make a whole big step change forward. All right. And with that, I wanted to close and thank you very much.